أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم صلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers. Welcome to our discussion series on Usul al-Fiqh, and in this series we are planning to cover and go through the book called al-Halaqat al-Ula of Shahid Baqir al-Sadr. Obviously, if you are watching this series and are interested in this series, the assumption is that you have at least some understanding of what Usul al-Fiqh is and what it is about. Obviously, you may not know all the discussions or even the technicalities about it yet. That's why you may be here, but you kind of probably know the importance of that subject, right? And that's why you are interested in learning about Usul al-Fiqh, because Usul is one of the most important disciplines and subjects that was worked on by the Muslim scholarship uh, for centuries, for centuries and centuries. And as they always say, that usul and fiqh, but even more importantly, usul, or they basically say usul al fiqh, the usul for the fiqh, principles of jurisprudence, is the bread and butter, as they say, the bread and butter of the Hausa, but it is also the bread and butter of, of a human, because it teaches you not just principles that you will later utilize in the discipline of fiqh, but it actually has so many principles and concepts and theories that will actually just make you a very organized person in life. And it will allow you to think correctly, it will allow you to think rationally, it will allow you to figure out how to make proper decisions in life, because there are so many discussions in it that have actually nothing to do with fiqh. They have a lot to do with language and how language is used and how you reconcile statements, and how do you there's a discussion on epistemology, what type of knowledge and source material gives you conviction, what type of it does not give you conviction. So they have discussed so many topics, different topics within this vast discipline of usul, even though the original purpose of it may not have been that. But over the centuries, they ended up discussing almost everything in it. And that's why it's such an important field. So, for example, yes, it is true that in Arabic grammar, when you study Arabic grammar, you learn a lot about the, the meaning of the different paradigms, the different wazns, the abwab. You learn so much about that. But you would be surprised that at a certain point, if you want to go even deeper into certain nahwi discussions or even certain discussions in sarf, you're actually going to end up finding those discussions in some random usul book by some scholar. Because while they are discussing a certain topic, let's say in English, let's say about a language, like a jumla khabariya or jumla insha'iyya. Now, jumla khabariya could be something that can be discussed in nahu, or inshaq is something that can be discussed in nahu as well. But the analysis and the philosophical analysis of that statement, you're actually going to find it in usul al-fiqh, basically. So this is definitely one of the most important subjects. Now, obviously, because it is the most important subject, you can imagine hundreds and hundreds of books and treatises and articles, and so much has been written in this field. Even from the perspective of studying it, from as a textbook, there are some textbooks that have been written in the last, especially in the last 100, 200 years, that students can kind of go through in the hawzat and stuff. I'm not, in this series, or at least in this lesson, first lesson, I'm not planning to go through the history of usul and the literature that was written and all of that stuff, even though it is very important. But maybe that can be recorded in a different set of lectures, because if we start going through the history of usul and the developments that have happened in usul, that's like maybe 10 other lessons on its own. Shahid Sadr does kind of do it initially in the introduction of one of his other books. He goes through like the history of usul and development, but it can even be lengthier and can be even more detailed than that. But I will mention a couple important points before we begin our first lesson in the first chapter of Halaqat, basically. Just to kind of give a bit more context. Look, Usul in the previous books, So in the past, perhaps they would study a book called al-Qawaneen, or they would study a book called al-Ma'alim, or even Usul of Muzaffar, which is very famous, and still it is widely read in the Hawzat, especially in the Iranian Hawza, is very commonly studied. Where the book of Shahid Sadr differentiates itself from the rest of the books is in two, three points. Okay, and I have actually my own al-Ula right here. It's very thin. You can see the first part is a very thin book. I don't know about not even 30 chapters, 29 chapters, and I have a lot of my notes still written on it from back 2014, I guess 2015 maybe. So I'm gonna be relying on my textbook as well for giving these classes. And there were three sort of shortcomings of the past literature when it came to usul. I'm talking about Shi'i books. And the first one of them is the actual content of those books. So for example, I have a book called Al-Rasail of Sheikh Ansari. It is somewhere up here, these red books over here basically. These are even studied today in the higher stages of usul. When you're in higher stages of usul, maybe 8-9 years later, you're gonna study these books of Sheikh Ansari. But imagine like you were put into introductory usul by being introduced to it through Rasail. Well, you're gonna struggle a lot because there is so much content in there, and this is about 200 years ago, and that book is being written in a context where they are still talking about discussions that are they're dealing with akhbaris basically. When you start reading it, you're gonna be so confused, like, oh, why is he talking about whether the Quran is even hujjah or not? The apparent meaning of the Quran. Is it a hujjah or not? Like, what kind of a silly question is that? Of course it's hujjah. Of course you can use the apparent meaning of the Quran as evidence. Well, no. They're discussing this because at that time, the akhbari movement was still, it had kind of died down, but it was still kind of like the usulis were just coming out of that, that entire debate that had happened for so many, 200 years. That was still a discussion. So the content itself is kind of like, there are discussions that are in those earlier books that are completely maybe irrelevant, or you will not even understand them because so much of it is interaction with the akhbaris. And I didn't know how much the usulis engaged with the akhbaris until I myself studied these books. And when I studied, for example, when you study Rasail, you realize, wow, every other section there is something about the akhbaris. So it kind of shows you the dominance of the akhbari thought and the akhbari scholarship, and how much they were engaging with each other back and forth. So it was a big deal at that time, and it is discussed in all of these old classical books. So, Shaykh Sadr doesn't need to start introducing you to those concepts right from the beginning, because it's not gonna make sense to you. And this is true for some other textbooks as well. For example, when you study philosophy, let's say you study Bidayatul Hikmah, right? There's a difference between studying Alama Tabatabay's Bidayatul Hikmah and Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi's Amudush Falsafe, philosophical instructions. Bidayatul Hikmah, he starts right off the bat with what is existence and whether it has primacy or not, whether it has asalatul wujud or not. As a beginner student, if you don't know the history and philosophy and what's going on, and what did Ibn Sina say, and what did Suhrawardi say, and what did Mullah Sadra say, you're gonna be confused. Like, why are you talking about existence? What's the point of this? And why is he discussing asalatul wujud? So that was an issue. But Allama Tabatabai, when he wrote it, he's probably thinking about higher level students that already have an awareness of it. But now if Bidayatul Hikmah is taught at a very early stage, in let's say 3-4 years into the Hawza, well, students usually don't have enough grasp and understanding, historically speaking, to be able to comprehend the book. So that's why Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi's book, in that sense, is better, because he really starts off with like the history and then the epistemology, and he really builds the foundations one by step, and it makes it easier for a student to really grasp the concepts and even understand the significance of it. So Shahid Sadr is going to do exactly that. He will not talk about topics that are kind of irrelevant, or maybe if he does even bring them up, he will bring them up at a later stage in the second book or the third book that he has. Okay, so that's number one, the content itself. Second is the way that the classical books were written. They were written for mujtahideen. So Ar-Rasail, even though we study it in the Hawza before you even get to Dars al-Kharij or Bahth al-Kharij, it is actually a book written for people who are mujtahideen already. So it is like writing an academic, it's like an academic book, a PhD writing for another PhD student. That's kind of what these books were all about. So when they're writing, the writing is very, very difficult and it's very technical, and sometimes there are words in it that only another mujtahid will understand the sort of what the scholar is talking about and what they're referring to. An average kid who just picks up the book even after 4 or 5 years, they're not even gonna understand half the references and half of the allusions that the scholars are making because they're so advanced and technical. But that's what those books were. The kayfiyat of it was like that. The way of writing was very, very terse and very complicated, and that's why even a book like Kifaya of Akhund Khurasani is very tough to understand it. Like you need teachers to kind of explain you every single line of what the Akhund Khurasani is saying, because they're not writing for you and I, right? So that's something that was important. And from a pedagogical perspective, when you're introducing usul and teaching usul to students, well, Kifaya of Akhund Khurasani or Rasail of Sheikh Ansari or even Qawaneen of Mirza Qumi and these books, they're not really gonna help the students too much. They're gonna make them struggle. So Shahid Sadr decides to write a book in a way where he starts with the building blocks step by step, takes you from the very beginning. Even inshallah we will cover it today. He explains what is usul, like what are we even talking about. So step by step, he will take you to the higher stages. That's what Shahid Sadr does. And then a third point that is very important, which Shahid Sadr does not do, and other scholars in the past did. Imagine you are studying al-Qawaneen or Rasail or even Usul of Mudaffar. They're going to be having a discussion, and in the middle of a discussion, they will mention a reference or a point which you will come across, and you're going to be like, what does this mean? And the problem is, those discussions are mentioned in later chapters of the book. So, from a logical perspective, they make a blunder. For example, Usul Muzaffar, he doesn't talk about a discussion called Hujjiyah, which we will inshallah get introduced to, Hujjiyah of Qat and all of these discussions until much later on. Even though right from the beginning there is an assumption of Hujjiyatul Qat in the book, right, in different areas. So it's like, wait, you haven't even explained what the Hujjiyatul Qat is, but a lot of discussions are revolving around that assumption, but it will come later on. So Shahid Sadr, the reason why his book is so profound is that he starts with the discussions that are required. So logically, they make a lot more sense. So he builds you off one by one by one. So first he will do definition of usul, then the subject matter of usul, then hujjiyah of qat, and then so now you've done the hujjiyah of qat. Okay, now everything will be built on this. Not that he will start off with like, I don't know, khabar wahid, and then after khabar wahid later on he will talk about hujjiyah of qat. It's not, it's other books are very disorganized like that, right? Whereas Shahid Sadr gave Usul al-Fiqh a very new sort of nazm, a very new order of discussions. Obviously, other ulama, some of them have critiqued some of the chapter headings and saying, no, maybe this one should come before, and so on and so forth. Those are for the discussions that ulama have, but otherwise the book is really, really good in the sense that he has taken the usuli books of the past and has compressed them in a very orderly fashion. So what he has done is he's written 3 books, and they're called Halaqat. Okay, like Halaqat even means episodes actually in the Arabian world. When you watch a season, for example, al-Ula means episode 1. So first section, second section, third section, right? So first book, second book, third book. The first book is what we have over here, about very thin, 30 chapters. It is literally for beginners. You don't need to know anything for this to understand it. That's how beginners it is. But after this, he will go on to the second book, which, I think it's like somewhere, maybe somewhere up there in my bookshelf, right? That's going to be the second part. And then from the second part, which is a little bit more advanced, it takes much longer to study it. Then he will go to the third book, which is actually 2 sections, 2 parts, 2 volumes. So it's very lengthy. And that is basically a replacement of a book like Kifaya or a book like Rasail. And after that, you can go into Bahs al-Kharij. So these are the three books that Shaykh Sadr does, and each book kind of builds on top of one another. And the way he has written it and organized it is really, really good. Especially when you study al-Halaqat, and then you kind of try and study, I don't know, al-Mujiz of Ja'far Subhani, or Usul of al-Muzaffar, these other books, you don't feel that good about it, because, Shaykh Sadr really did an excellent job. And at that time, for him to be thinking about the pedagogy of teaching and whatnot, it is really, really shows you how far-sighted he was. He really was realizing the issues that were occurring in the seminaries, and students becoming weaker in their understanding of the disciplines. So he wrote a textbook that is suitable to train students much better, and to equip them much better, especially for a time where the education reforms were happening in Iraq, and Saddam was there, and even in the Iran reforms were happening during the Shah's time, and even after the revolution. In that context, for him to think about this and to write a book that quick, because from as far as we know, he wrote these books in a very, very short span of time, and he was killed by Saddam Hussein soon after that. So so it's very interesting that he wrote these. I'm sure like he didn't get a chance to even edit them. So maybe sometimes you can see like very slight mistakes sometimes. So you can tell like he was writing them in a rush. But subhanallah, he wrote these books, and we have them today. So in today's lesson, by the way, so you can actually you can find Usul al-Halaqat al-Ula. Well, actually, you can find all the halaqat in this PDF form here. Durus fi ilm al-usul al-Halaqat al-Ula wa thaniya. So this is part 1 and part 2 of Shahid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. Now you can we're gonna go to right here al-Halaqat al-Ula. Okay, kitabun dirasi fi ilm usul al-fiqh. Okay, it has been prepared for the mubtadi'in fi dirasati hadha al-ilm, for complete beginners. Okay, so it's literally written for beginners. So this is just a preface. This is also not written by Shahid Sadr. This is okay, yeah, sorry. This is not the preface. Before the preface, he has written a sort of introduction on the pedagogy that he is putting in. Okay, so he himself is saying that look, ulama, they used to study al-ma'alim and al-qawaneen and al-rasail wal-kifaya, and he's like, he's basically pointing out all the issues with these books. Okay. Anyways, so he gives justifications for why he wrote the book like this. And like, for example, he says the reason why these books are not good to start off with, because he said أن هذه الكتب الأربعة تمثل مراحل مختلفة في الفكر الأصولي. He's like, look, each 4 of these books are talking about different stages. They contain discussions from different stages of the development of usul. So Ma'alim is مرحلة قديمة تاريخيا عن علم الأصول من علم الأصول. It's like it's an old book, so the discussions in it are gonna be very old. Okay, whereas Qawaneen is a later stage, and all the way till Sheikh Ansari, basically until it came to Sheikh Ansari, and then from Rasail and Kifaya, it is a result of the Usuli developments more than 100 years ago, almost, he says. So he says, look, this is such an old book, so we need to update these books and so on. Anyways, as I said, the discussion of Usul and the history of Usul and the development of Usul is a whole different discussion, and definitely it's something that is worth recording and also writing about and recording, inshallah, for another series. But for this series, I don't want to spend too much time in the history and all of that. We're going to go through just the book itself. So he wrote this 18 Rajab 1397 Hijri in Najaf. Okay. So he says, وَبَعْدْ فَإِنَّ هَذِهِ هِيَ الْحَلَقَةُ الْأُولَى, the first chapter, first book, من دروس في علم العصول وَدَعَنَاهَا لِلْمُبْتَدِئِينَ بِدِرَاسَةِ هَذَا الْعِلْمِ. Okay, so I've written this book for the complete beginners of this discipline. And after that, there are going to be two other halaqat or halaqatan, inshallah. And from these three, they will be ready for abhathul kharij. So literally, he tried to revamp the entire Hawza structure, which is unbelievable what he tried to do on his own at the age of, barely like 40, mid 40s. It is actually a very, if somebody understands what he did, it's actually very insane how he's able to do that, because that is really, really mind blowing. Right, in mid 40s, and then he was killed by by Saddam Hussein. Okay, so for the purpose of our lessons, I'm not gonna try and read too much because I was gonna spend a lot of time, but because this is the very first lesson, I will try and read the first lesson just to kind of give an introduction to the book and kind of explain what's going on. And if anybody is also practicing their Arabic, they can kind of follow along and see what's going on. So just for this first lesson, I will try to read. For other lessons, I will probably just summarize the discussions, the chapter, and if there is some very important section that we need to read, we'll read that. But otherwise, the plan is not to read the entire text line by line and to decipher it, which is kind of how it is done in the Hawzat. No, I don't plan to do that. It's very time consuming, and it's mostly good if you're trying to practice your Arabic, But for now, inshallah, but for today's lesson, we will try to do that. So let's start, inshallah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, with the very first chapter of this first halaqat. And he starts with the chapter called At-Ta'rif bi-Ilm al-Usul. As you know, all the classical Islamic books written in the Islamic world always start with the definition of the discipline. What are we trying to study? And oh, by the way, this book has also been translated into English. Okay, so it's been translated into English by Roy Muttahide, and you can download this online. I think you can find it. So basically, you can follow along with the translation over here. Okay, so let's just read it quickly and try and understand what he is saying. كلمة تمهيدية, introductory statement. بعد أن آمن الإنسان بالله والإسلام والشريعة, after humans have accepted Allah and Islam and the Sharia, وعرف أنه مسؤول بحكم كونه عبدا لله تعالى عن امتثال أحكامه, and he has recognized and understood that he is now answerable in the face of Allah as a servant of Allah for fulfilling and carrying out the ahkam. Okay, he understands that he is responsible in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يصبح ملزما بالتوفيق بين سلوكه في مختلف مجالات الحياة والشريعة الإسلامية. Okay, he's now responsible basically to fulfill and have a suluk, act in a way in different parts of his life. He has to make a connection between different parts of his life, between his hayat and the Shariatul Islamiyya. Basically, he has to adopt the Sharia. How? And what else? وباتخاذ الموقف العملي الذي تفرض عليه تبعيته للشريعة. And he has to accept and take on a practical conduct which is basically according to the Sharia, which follows the Sharia. Okay, ولأجل هذا كان لزاما على الإنسان أن يعين هذا الموقف العملي ويعرف كيف يتصرف في كل واقعة. And because of this, it is required and necessary for a person to identify this practical conduct. What do I have to practically do in my life? What do I have to do? How do I do tasarruf fi kulli waqi'atin? In all dimensions and aspects of my life, how am I supposed to behave? Okay, so what is Shahid Sadr saying? He's saying after you have accepted that there is a God, there's a Prophet, there's Islam, there's the Sharia, and you now accept that you are a servant in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is His dominion, it is His domain. The question is, you now become responsible for ensuring that the Sharia, your life and the different dimensions of your life are in accordance to the Sharia. You have to basically make a connection. You have to reconcile between your life and the Sharia. How? By identifying and acting upon the right practical conduct, which is from the Sharia, and that's how you will be able to do that. Okay, where do you have to do it? What part of your life? في كل واقعة, in every single aspect of your life. So that assumes what they call shumul al-sharia. Okay, this premise assumes that for every single reality and instance of your life, there is a hukm shar'i. This is what the assumption is over here. That, this is basically how the laymen say Islam is a way of life. Islam, when they say Islam is a way of life, they say that they assume that every single instance of your life, even the fact that I'm sitting right down over here, Allah has a hukm shar'i, a sharia law over here for me. Is this mubah? Is this mustahab? Is it haram? Is it makruh? What is this? There's a law. You have to figure out what that law is, basically. Okay, so that's what he is talking about in the beginning. Okay. Then he says, ولو كانت أحكام الشريعة في كل الوقائع واضحة وضوحا بديهيا للجميع. If these ahkam of Sharia for every single aspect of our lives were obvious and clear and self-evident for everyone, لكان تحديد الموقف العملي المطلوب تجاه الشريعة في كل واقعة أمرا ميسورا لكل أحد. He's like, look, if these were so clear and obvious and self-evident for everyone, figuring out the practical conduct which is matlub, which is desired and preferred as far as the Sharia is concerned, for every single aspect of our life, it would have been a very easy thing for us to figure out. ولما احتاج إلى بحث علمي ودراسة واسعة. It's like, yeah, you wouldn't need a complicated discussion, ilmi discussion, and extensive durus to figure out what you have to do in life. ولكن عوامل عديدة منها بعدنا الزمني عن عصر التشريع أدت إلى عدم وضوح عدد كبير من أحكام الشريعة واكتنافها بالغموض. He's like, but the problem is because of many factors. From those factors, one of the main factors is our lengthy distance from the time of the era of Tashri', meaning the time of the Prophet. It's been 14 centuries since the Tashri', the Asr of Tashri' was there. The era of Tashri' was 14 centuries ago. Because of our lengthy distance from that era, it has resulted in عدم وضوح عدد كبير من أحكام الشريعة, because it has resulted in ambiguity and not a lot of clarity for in a lot of the ahkam of Sharia, and it has sort of thrown us into confusion, actually, right? Because we're so far away from the era of the Sharia that the rulings for every single aspect of our life are not that clear. And because they are not clear, okay, وعلى هذا الأساس, okay, because it's not clear, it's then ضروري to present an ilm, a science, a discipline, يتولى دفع الغموض, that is responsible for removing the confusion عن الموقف العملي تجاه الشريعة في كل واقعة بإقامة الدليل على تعيينه. There should be a discipline that is created, or that is there, that takes the accountability and the responsibility for removing the confusion from what our practical conduct is supposed to be according to the Sharia in every single aspect of our life. How? By establishing evidence for what that practical conduct is. Okay? وَهَكَذَا كَانَ, and this is exactly how it was. فقد أنشئ علم الفقه للقيام بهذه المهمة. So this is actually why the ilm of fiqh was developed. Fiqh was developed for this purpose, the science of fiqh. Why? فهو يشتمل على تحديد الموقف العملي تجاه الشريعة تحديدا استدلاليا Fiqh, what does fiqh do? It identifies and tells us what our practical conduct is supposed to be as per the Sharia. But it does so by giving an istidlal, giving an evidence, giving an argument. والفقيه في علم الفقه يمارس إقامة الدليل على تعيين الموقف العملي في كل حدث من أحداث الحياة. So what does a jurist do in the science of fiqh, in ilm al-fiqh? He practices or he establishes the evidence for what the practical conduct has to be in every single event and instance of our life. Right? وهذا ما نطلق عليه اسم عملية استنباط الحكم الشرعي. So this is what we refer to, the process of deriving a hukm shari, a religious law. So fiqh is the process. So in fiqh, what do we do? What does the faqih do? He engages in a process, amaliya, process of istinbat. Istinbat means to derive. What does he derive in this process? A hukm shari, the legal ruling that Allah has legislated. ولأجل هذا يمكن القول بأن علم الفقه هو علم استنباط الأحكام الشرعية أو علم عملية الاستنباط بتعبير آخر. So it's like, based on this, because of this, we can say that the science of fiqh, okay, the fiqh, what is the definition of it? It is the discipline of deriving the ahkam sharia, the legal laws, or the discipline or the science of the process of deriving, in other words. Okay? So he says, look, this is what fiqh does. So, brothers and sisters, like, he has not yet defined usul al-fiqh. He is defining fiqh. He's saying, look, we need to know what we have to do. So we came up with a science called fiqh. What does fiqh do? Fiqh tells us what our practical conduct should be, but it doesn't just tell you, it also gives you the evidence for it. Gives you the reason. Tells you this hadith is weak, this hadith is authentic, this hadith means this hadith means that, and it tells you eventually what you have to do in your day-to-day life. Okay, so the science that science, what are you doing in that science? It is the science where you are deriving the Sharia law, basically. Okay, so figuring out the he says, okay, so figuring out the mawqif al-amali, your practical conduct with evidence, can only be done in the ilm al-fiqh in two ways. Okay, with two ways. Okay, one way is that tahdiduhu bi ta'yin al-hukm al-shari. Okay, so one is that you literally figure out what the hukm shari is. Okay, he says you can do this by figuring out, literally, you can tell me salat is wajib. That's the hukm shari. Okay, or siyam, saum is wajib in the month of Ramadan, for example. So you have come and told me literally what the hukm shari is. But wal akhir, there's another way. And that is the تحديد الوظيفة العملية تجاه الحكم المشكوك بعد استحقام الشك وتعذر تعيينه. He says, no, but sometimes what happens is we will just tell you what your practical conduct should be when the hukm is mashkuk, when the hukm is unknown actually. And we are unable to figure out what the hukm over here is. Okay? Over there, the fiqh will just tell you what you're supposed to. So for example, if you are unsure if a certain meat is haram or halal, okay, so you have shak over here. You don't know what the hukm is over here. Okay? So it will tell you to apply, for example, bara'a. For example, like it will say everything is halal until proven otherwise. Or it will say everything, this specific, meats are haram until proven that they are slaughtered. So these type of principles, they're not really telling you in reality what's going on. You have a doubt, so you're unable to figure out. So they're going to tell you what your practical conduct should be in the case of doubt and your inability to figure out. Okay, so that means it's not the real hukm. It is an apparent hukm. والأدلة التي تستعمل في الأسلوب الأول نسميها بالأدلة أو الأدلة المحرزة. He says the evidence that is used in the first method over here, we will call them al-adilla, meaning evidences, dalil, or al-adillatul muhraza, evidences that explain to us and unveil for us and clarify for us what the real hukm shari is. Why? Because إذ يحرز بها الحكم الشرعي, because that adilla explained for us or clarified for us what the hukm shari is. والأدلة التي تستعمل في الأسلوب الثاني تسمى بالأدلة العملية أو الأصول العملية. But the second evidence that is used for the second sort of methodology, we are going to call them al-usul al-amaliya, i.e. procedural principles, because those principles don't really tell us what the real hukm shari is. It is just telling us what our practical conduct should be. So that's the difference over here. Inshallah, this will become even more clarified eventually. Okay? But in both the approaches, في كلا الأسلوبين يمارس الفقيه في علم الفقه استنباط الحكم الشرعي، أي يحدد الموقف العملي تجاهه بالدليل. But in both cases, whether it's the first case or the second case, the faqih is basically telling us and identifying for us what our practical conduct should be. Okay. Now, وعمليات الاستنباط التي يشتمل عليه علم الفقه بالرغم من تعددها وتنوعها. He says, look, the process of deriving the laws, which is what ilm al-fiqh does, even though there are so many different laws and so many different types of laws, right? Salat, Sawm, Hajj, Zakat, marriage, divorce, there's so many different things in fiqh. تشترك في عناصر موحدة وقواعد عامة تدخل فيها على تعددها وتنوعها. He says, but despite that, there are, all of these chapters of fiqh and laws of fiqh and types of different rulings, they all share certain common elements and certain common principles that are there in every single one of these rulings that are always utilized. وقد تطلبت هذه العناصر المشتركة في عملية الاستنباط وضع علم خاص بها لدراستها وتحديدها وتهيئتها لعلم الفقه فكان علم الأصول. He says these principles and these elements that exist in all of the fiqh that are common, it required that a separate discipline be placed for it so that they can be studied and they can be refined and worked on and then later used in the ilm al-fiqh. And that discipline is what we call ilm al-usul. So what does he do? He goes and he starts to define ilm al-usul. So now the second chapter is a little bit longer. The text is a little bit longer, but we will inshallah cover it regardless because we've only done 40 minutes. So we'll do this. So now he's going to go into ta'rif of ilm al-usul. He says, and because of this, وعلى هذا الأساس نرى أن يعرف علم الأصول بأنه العلم بالعناصر المشتركة في عملية استنباط الحكم الشرعي. He says, because of this, we can now define usul as the science or the discipline or the knowledge of the common elements that exist during the process of deriving law. Okay? The common elements, okay, your knowledge or the study of the common elements that exist in the process of deriving law. So he says, okay, let me explain. What are these common elements? Okay, what are these common elements? Okay. So, for example, he gives examples. He says, assume, ifradu, okay, do a fard, just pretend that a jurist faces these questions. Is it haram for a person who is fasting to submerge their head in water? Question number 2. Is it obligatory and wajib for a person uh, when they inherit wealth from their father, do they have to pay khums on it? Question number 3, does laughing break the salat? If you laugh in the middle of salat, does your salat become batil? So these are 3 questions. Okay, so in each of these 3 questions, you have to figure out, what do I have to do? What is my practical conduct? What should be my practical conduct over here, right? But if you notice, one question is about fasting, one question is about irth, one is about salat. 3 different chapters in fiqh. And in fact, it's not even about just irth. It is about irth and khums. So it's like a very complicated, in the sense that these are not the same topic. These are 3 different topics. So the faqih is going to go and try and figure this out. But the things that's going to happen is that for this question, he's going to find some narration. For this question, he will find maybe some other narration. For this one, he will find some other narration from some other imam. So the narrations are all different. But when he is engaging with those traditions and narrations, or maybe even ijma or the aql, he will be using certain similar process elements in all 3 of those narrations. And that's what we're going to call ilm al-usul. So for example, okay, he says, so imagine the first question. وَيَسْتَنْبِتُ ذَلِكَ بِالطَّرِيقَةِ التَّالِيَةِ. He says, the first question, he will try and answer in this way. There's a riwayah, there's a narration by a companion called Yaqub bin Shu'ayb from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, ala hurmatil irtimas ala saim. So he says, okay, a faqih comes across this narration, and it says Imam Sadiq says it is haram to submerge your head if you are fasting. And this is what the hadith actually says. لا يرتسم المحرم في الماء ولا الصائم. So a person, this is the actual narration. This is it. This is the word. Okay, it is from Wasail al-Shia. It's a reference from Wasail al-Shia. That a person who is in ihram does not or should not submerge their head in water, and neither should a person who is fasting. Okay. He's saying that this tradition, in the general urf, the way that it is understood, it signifies on hurma, that it is haram to submerge your head in water. Because the Imam says, La yartamis. Do not, a person who is in ihram and fasting, they should not submerge their head in water. So that means it's going to break your fast. Okay. The narrator of the Nas is Yaqub bin Shu'ayb, and he is thiqa. Okay? And a thiqa, he says, even though sometimes they can make mistakes, and sometimes, so on and so forth, they can make mistakes and stuff. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the shari' means legislator, but it is referred to Allah, has commanded us to not accuse somebody who is thiqa of making mistakes and lying, just for no reason. And he has considered his qawl hujjah. When a reliable, trustworthy person comes to you, that this person is, a hujjah, you can use that as evidence. وَالنَّتِيجَةِ هِيَ أَنَّ الْإِرْتِمَاسِ حَرَامٌ. So this means that the irtimas is going to be haram. So look, the faqih has just gone through a process. He has taken this narration, he has come across this narration, he looked at this guy, he said, okay, this person is trustworthy. Then he looked at this narration and he says, la yartamis. It says, no, do not. So do not means haram. Okay, so he's going to basically give the fatwa saying it is haram to submerge your head in water, right? Okay, what about the second question? He says, second question should be no, meaning you do not have to pay khums. Why? Because the riwayah of Ali bin Mahziyar جاءت في مقام تحديد الأموال التي يجب فيها الخمس وورد فيها أن الخمس ثابت في الميراث الذي لا يحتسب من غير أب ولا ابن. He is saying that the narration from Ali bin Mahziyar says that khums is there only in that inheritance which is not from your father or your son. Okay, so that means that if you inherit from your father, there's no khums on it. والعرف العام يفهم من هذه الجملة أن الشارع لم يجعل خمسا على الميراث الذي ينتقل من الأب إلى ابنه. So he says, okay, when a general urf, people in society read this narration or hear this narration, that Imam is saying that khums is only thabit in the inheritance if it is not from your father or your son. Well, that means that there's no khums if you inherit it from your father. So that's what we've understood over here. And the rawi is thika. And as we said, the khabaru thika is hujjah. So what is the natija? What is the conclusion? أن الخمس في تركة الأب غير واجب. The khums in the inheritance and the remains of whatever the father left behind is not wajib. Okay. What about the third question? Third question was about laughing. And the riwayah of Zurara from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says, al-qahqaha, meaning laughing, لا تنقض الوضوء وتنقض الصلاة. So he says the kahkaha, the laughing, does not break the wudu, but it breaks the salat. And once again, the general urf understands from the word naqd. Okay, naqd, noon, qaf, dad, that anna salat tabtul biha, that your salat becomes batil from laughing. And zurara is thika, and as we said, khabaru thika is hujjah. فصلاة مع الكهكها باطلة إذن. So that means salat, when it is when somebody laughs in it, it breaks it, it invalidates it. Now, look at this. He says, let's look at what happened. He says in the first hukam, the faqih relied on riwayah of Yaqub bin Shu'ayb. In the second narration, he relied upon Ali bin Mahziyar, and third one he relied upon Zurara. وَلِكُلٍّ مِّنَ الرِّوَايَاتِ الثَّلَاثِ مَتْنُهَا وَتَرْكِيبُهَا اللَّفْظِيَ الْخَاص الَّذِي يَجِبُ أَن يَدْرُسُ بِدِقَّةٍ وَيُحَدِّدَ مَعْنَاهُ. He says, so not only did he rely on all these three narrators, but the faqih also had to really pay attention to the sentence structures and the composition of the sentence, and really figure out biddiqqa, with precision, what does it mean. Okay, so he's showing you that each sentence is different and each narrator is different. So there is differences over here. ولكن توجد في مقابل هذا التنوع وهذه الاختلافات بين المواقف الثلاثة. He says, but despite these tanawwu, the variety of these differences that exist in these three narrations, and the different hukam, even the hukams are different, right? There exists anasir mushtarika. There are some common elements. أدخلها الفقيه في عملية الاستنباط في المواقف الثلاثة جميعا. That a jurist inserted in each three processes, in each three rulings, when he was going through the process, he inserted similar principles every single time. What is the principle? فَمِن تِلْكَ الْعَنَاصِرِ الْمُشْتَرَكَةِ. From those principles are, number one, الرجوع إلى العرف العام في فهم الكلام الصادر عن المعصوم. He says he referred to the عرف العام to understand what the ma'soom meant. Okay, in order to understand what the ma'soom is saying, he's speaking Arabic. How are you going to understand what this Arabic sentence means? What you do, what the faqih did, he kind of looked at how the general urf and how does general society, how do they use these words? Okay, what do they mean when they say don't do this or do this? And he realized that, okay, yeah, when urf says don't do this, that means, it's prohibited, for example. وَهُوَ مَا يُعَبِّرُ عَنْهُ بِحُجِّيَّةِ الظُّهُورِ الْعُرْفِ. This is what we call حُجِّيَّةُ الظُّهُور, the hujjiyah, the binding force of the prima facie meaning. So look, he used this assumption and this principle in every single narration. He relied on the urf al-am, what the urf understands, the general urf, okay, not urf al-khas, not specialists of a certain field. No. General public, the general society, what do they understand? Because it is their language that is being spoken. Imam is not using some technical jargon in these sentences that you would have to refer to the urf of some khas people, some specific people, for example, or experts in a certain, like philosophers, for example, or scientists. No. He is speaking the general language of how people speak. So when he speaks like that, it has a prima facie meaning, and that prima facie meaning is hujjah. You can use it as evidence. So he used this principle and this common element in all three of the narrations. Okay. فحجية الظهور إذن عنصر مشترك في عمليات الاستنباط الثلاث. It was used مشترك, meaning it was equally used in all three istinbat, in all three processes of deriving law. وكذلك يوجد عنصر مشترك آخر. There's another common element as well. وهو حجية خبر الثقة. Okay. He says that there is one more thing that is also commonly used over here, and that is that the faqih realized that all three narrators were thiqah. Right? So, and the thiqah, the khabar of a thiqah, the report of a thiqah, trustworthy person, is hujjah. And he utilized this assumption and this principle in all three of the narrations. Okay? So he says likewise that, so now we realize that وهكذا نستنتج أن عمليات الاستنباط تشتمل على عناصر مشتركة كما تشتمل على عناصر خاصة. He says, so now we know that the process of deriving law has certain elements which are common in all the chapters of fiqh. You're going to use them. And then there are some elements that will just be used in specific sections of fiqh. So there may be certain specific principles and specific elements that are just used in salat rulings, or that will just come up in inheritance rulings or marriage rulings or contract law. There are certain principles that are just used in contract law. You will never see them being utilized in the process of deriving law when it comes to salat. So those are just what they call fiqhi principles. But we're talking about, so he says, وَنَعْنِي بِالْعَنَاصِرِ الْخَاصَّةِ. What do I mean by the khas, specific ones? تِلْكَ الْعَنَاصِرِ الَّتِي تَتَغَيَّرْ مِنْ مَسْأَلَةٍ إِلَى أُخْرَى. Okay? He says these are principles that differ from one issue to another issue. فرواية يعقوب بن شعيب عنصر خاص في عملية استنباط حرمة الارتماس. He says this riwayah of Yaqub bin Shu'aib, it is an element, right? It is a variable that is being used in deriving law, but it is khas. It is it can only be used in the chapter of fasting and whether a person fasting can submerge their head in water. It's not, this hadith is irrelevant when it comes to salat, for example, or marriage or inheritance. Okay, لأنها لم تدخل في عمليات الاستنباط الأخرى بل دخلت بدلا عنها عناصر خاصة أخرى كرواية علي عنهما over here عنهما عناصر خاصة أخرى كرواية علي بن محزيار ورواية زرارة. He says in the other narrations, in the other questions, two other narrations were used, and they were also specific for just those two other masalas, like the narration of Ali bin Mahziyar and Zurara. So he says these are the khas ones, but he's like, look, we're not going to care about these khas elements, these specific elements in Usul al-Fiqh. We are going to care about the anasir al-mushtarika. That's what we care about in Usul al-Fiqh. So he says, وَنَعْنِي بِالْعَنَاصِرِ الْمُشْتَرِكَةِ القواعد العامة التي تدخل في عمليات استنباط أحكام عديدة في أبواب مختلفة. He says, what I mean by the common elements are these general principles which are inserted or exist in the process of deriving law, but not just any one law, multiple laws in multiple sections of fiqh. This is the key point. Okay? The common elements are general principles that are present and that are there in the process of deriving multiple laws in multiple chapters of fiqh, different chapters of fiqh. So a principle that exists in usul al-fiqh, it can be utilized in salat and sawm and hajj and irth and this, all the chapters, 50 plus chapters of fiqh, you can definitely use them. وفي علم الأصول تدرس العناصر المشتركة. We or تدرس العناصر المشتركة. The common elements are studied. وفي علم الفقه تدرس العناصر الخاصة في كل مسألة. In fiqh, we study the specific elements for each chapter and each issue. That's what we do. That's what those evidence becomes. But in usul al-fiqh, in the principles of fiqh, we study the common elements. Okay. He says, علم الأصول لا يحدد العناصر المشتركة فحسب. He says علم الأصول doesn't just identify for us what these common elements are, but يحدد أيضا درجات استعمالها والعلاقة بينها كما سنرى في البحوث المقبلة إن شاء الله تعالى. He says it doesn't just tell you about what those common elements are, but it also tells you the relationship between these common elements and how to use them, to what degree you have to use them, and where you have to use them, and how do you have to use them. He says, inshallah, we will see this in the future discussions. Inshallah, we will end with this one final section, which is called Mawdu' of Ilm al-Usul, meaning what are you studying really? What is the subject matter, okay, of Ilm al-Usul? Okay. He says لكل علم عادة موضوع أساسي ترتكز جميع بحوثه عليه وتدور حوله. He says for every ilm, generally speaking, there is a specific subject matter that all the other discussions revolve around. Okay. وتستحدث الكشف عما يرتبط بذلك الموضوع من خصائص وحالات وقوانين. He said, and the whole purpose of it is to really understand and uncover that subject matter and all the different qualities of that subject matter and all the rules and regulations that relate to that subject matter. Okay, so he says فالفيزياء, so physics, its subject matter is nature, and the discussions of physics, كلها, all of them are linked with tabi'ah, with nature, physical world. Okay, وتحاول الكشف عن حالاتها وقوانينها العامة. So what do you do in physics? Ultimately, you're just trying to figure out all the different rules and laws of nature and the physical world. Or for example, nahu, Arabic grammar, right? Syntax. Its subject matter is the kalima, okay, a word. لأنها يبحث عن حالات إعرابها وبنائها ورفعها ونصبها. So in the entire subject of nahu, even though there are so many different topics, but what is it ultimately that you are doing? You are just trying to figure out the different i'rab. Is it the i'rab, the banafir, or is it marfu, is it mansub, is it mabni? What is it? Right? Ultimately, that's what the subject matter is. So what is the mawdu of ilm al-usul, around which all the discussions revolve? He says, if you consider the definition that we gave, لعلم الأصول, we can figure out and identify that علم الأصول يدرس في الحقيقة الأدلة المشتركة في علم الفقه لإثبات دليليتها. وبهذا صح القول بأن موضوع علم الأصول هو الأدلة المشتركة في عملية الاستنباط. He says, if you look at our definition, and we said that ilm al-usul is the study of the common elements in the process of deriving law. He says in the subject matter and everything that we are going to be studying is going to revolve around these common elements. Okay, what are these common elements? The common elements that are going to be utilized in the process of deriving law. And that is what Shahid Sadr is basically saying. Okay, there's a lot of discussion on this whole discussion on, does a science even need a mawdu? Does it not need a mawdu? I think in the second halaqat, he kind of alludes to it again, and then the third one, he brings it up again because some scholars believe that you don't even need a mawdu for a discipline. That's another interesting discussion, but as I said, this is just a very beginner's book, and I'm not planning to go into a lot of these side points and stuff. Just gonna get this book and the contents of it across, inshallah. So that is what we have covered today. So just to recap everything, we said that look, after you have accepted Islam and you have accepted the Sharia, you realize that you need to follow some laws. Okay, how do you figure those laws out? Well, that's why they came up with the discipline of fiqh. Fiqh was where a jurist was gonna go and study the narrations and study the content of the narrations and tell you what you have to do in different situations. But they realize that when a jurist goes and he derives different rules, there are certain things that he has to do again and again and again, which are common, irrespective of which law he's deriving. So whether it has to do with fasting or praying or hajj or inheritance or marriage, there are certain things that he is doing every single time, regardless of which chapter or hadith or anything happens to be. Those common elements that are going to be utilized in every single process of deriving law, the Muslims decided to create a separate discipline for it, and they called it Usul al-Fiqh. So there was one called Fiqh, where the jurist was bringing evidence for their rulings. Then they said, well, there are certain things that are happening again and again and again. We're not going to keep discussing them every single time there's an issue pops up. We will create a separate discipline, call it principles of fiqh, principles of jurisprudence. And all of those common elements that are utilized in fiqh, we will come and study it in this field. And once we have our clarity on these principles, a jurist just has to go into fiqh, do all of his fiqhi evidences, and he will rely on the principles that he has come to a conclusion to on in Usul al-Fiqh. So the example that we gave was the three narrations. One was about fasting, one was about khums, one was about laughing in prayers. There were three different narrations, three different hadiths from two different imams, and the rulings were also different, but there was a common thing happening in each of those processes. One was that the jurist was relying on the understanding of the Arabic language of that time, and he used that as an assumption, and he understood the narration based on that assumption, and he used that as evidence. Well, that's something that you're gonna have to prove. Why is the common understanding hujjah? Why not some esoteric understanding should be hujjah? So we'll have to figure that out. And the second element that we utilized was that in each of those narrations, the narrator was trustworthy. Well, okay, we know that trustworthy people can sometimes lie and they can make mistakes. So why is that not a possibility in one of those narrations? Well, regardless, in Usul, you're going to come and discuss that. Can you rely on the narration of a trustworthy individual at all times? Sometimes. When can you do it? When can you not do it? You have to figure that out in Usul al-Fiqh. So the subject matter and everything that we will be discussing in Usul, all the discussions ultimately have to do and they revolve around these common elements that are going to be utilized in Usul, in Fiqh. So, alhamdulillah, we basically finished 2 chapters according to this version of the book. We finished 2 chapters, but inshallah we will continue now in the next lesson with chapter 3. So these are very, very short lessons, and Shahid Sadr doesn't go too lengthy in some of them. I may even skip some of them. Some of them are just very descriptive. For example, chapter 4, he's just he's just explaining the relationship between usul and fiqh and so on. But let's see, inshallah, we will see how we progress. We'll see you all, inshallah, in the next lesson. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.